Hello, I'm Ellie. I'm a PhD student of Sophia's, and I'm going to give a short video on Philippa Foot's moral naturalism, which I've been working on recently. I'm going to give an overview of her argument in Natural Goodness, which is her penultimate book or penultimate publication, published in 2001. And it's broadly her seminal work on naturalism. It's quite short, quite a good read, quite punchy. So I am going to give a little overview of that today. So just to give you a broad sort of overview, she's appealing to human nature as grounds for her argument, and it's as grounds to arguing that we are rational, but she also wants to define what it is to reason well. She's broadly an Aristotelian, neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalism, and as she pursues it, it's understood as a thesis concerning rationality, where rationality is understood to be a species' relative capacity. So our reasoning cannot ignore what we need as human beings and still claim to be practical rationality. So I'm going to share my screen and just go through some slides because I think it's a bit easier. Okay. So this is Philippa Foot. I'm going to go through some premises. Okay, so just a short introduction. Her central claim here, as it's written on the board, moral naturalism is an aspect of what makes us good as human beings. She claims that moral goodness is a form of natural goodness, the title of the book. In other words, being good and practicing the virtues, so being courageous, being kind, will help us to flourish as the kinds of beings that we are. So this idea, she's developing a strain of thought that she starts to develop in her early writings. So if you want to look at these, a good one is Goodness and Choice, published in 1961. And here she begins to defend the idea that there are objective features of living things that make them good as members of their species. So she's looking for an objective naturalism. So in doing this, as I've said, Foot defends a form of evaluation based on goodness and defect in living things, such as plants and animals, as is written on the board. So she starts her theory by looking at goodness and defect in plants and animals. According to this approach, there are objective features of living things that make them good as members of their species. So for example, there are objective features about a deer that depend on what it is to live a good life as a deer. So having 4 legs, for instance. So she gives us an example of a cactus in Natural Goodness. So she says there is a sense of a good cactus that's not merely a matter of preference that we have towards cacti. There are features of a good cactus independent of human beings that only depend on what it is to flourish as cactus. So that is a blighted, damaged, or otherwise unhealthy cactus is not, in this sense, a good cactus. So as I'll go on to explain, she claims the virtues make humans good in the same way that blight-free, lush green leaves make a cactus good. So the norms that determine what makes something good as a member of its kind, she calls natural norms. So John Hacker-Wright is a central interpreter of Philippa Foot, central philosopher who's looking at her work at the minute. He's written lots of helpful papers and books, which I urge you to read. A great introduction is Philippa Foot's Moral Thought, published in 2013. This year he's published a book called Philippa Foot's Meta-Ethics, which is a bit denser, but also a good read. It's published in 2021. Hacker-Wright claims that Foot's theory in natural goodness has 2 central premises, which I'm going to go through to help us understand what she's trying to argue in this book. So the first premise, as is said on the screen, is that grasping something as an organism requires us to situate the organism against the background of its species. Premise 2 says to situate the organism against that background of its species requires us to consider it from a normative perspective. So I'm going to go through these 2 premises in turn now. Premise 1 here. So grasping something as an organism requires us to situate the organism against the background of its species. So in forming this premise, Foot draws heavily on the work of her student Michael Thompson, also a good read. When we claim that an organism is living, Foot claims, we are situating it within a wider context of its kind, the organism's life form. she claims. Life forms determine the background of norms according to which creatures of the kind in question live. So, for example, wolves hunt in packs, oak trees have deep roots. The life form of the species is that which gives sense and understanding to the lives and processes of individuals of that species. So it's only against this broader picture of the life form description of certain activities, so for example, eating, growing, sleeping, walking, thinking, can be understood. So it's only against these broader pictures that the individual life forms can be understood. So in order to be described as living well at all, certain vital processes must occur. Descriptions of these processes are exclusive to living things, according to Foot. So nothing would fall under certain descriptions such as eating, growing, walking, and thinking if it didn't live. So a rock couldn't be described as thinking or walking. So basically, a set of all of these things, all of these descriptions, can be said to form our lives and the lives of other things in our species. Consider Thomson's example of eating. So for an organism, this is a quote, for an organism to be regarded as eating something, one must take it to be ingesting, which is normally nutritious for its kind, as well as absorbing in such a way as to derive nutrition from it. Otherwise, we could not say that we are witnessing an organism eating something, but instead we would be observing some fortuitous occurrence whereby an organism takes in some sort of material which happens to further its life. A particular organism is therefore only understandable in relation to its species and how an individual of that species characteristically lives, according to the background of a life form. The norms that determine what makes something good, a good member of its kind, are natural norms. So this is Footian terminology. So, as I've put on the screen here, another important thing to note is there is natural variation within species, most of which is not essential in order for a creature to function as one of its kind. What do I mean by this? To use one of Foot's own examples, a blue tit can lack the patch of blue on its head and still be a blue tit without being hindered in living its life. This is on page 30 of Natural Goodness. So on Foot's account, there are certain operations that are fixed, things that play a vital part in the life of a species. These are, she says, teleologically related to the good of the species. So to add in a bit more Footian terminology, she calls these judgments about vital operations Aristotelian categoricals. So examples of these judgments, again, wolves hunt in packs, lions have 4 legs, humans live in communities and homes. Aristotelian categoricals are employed whenever we identify something as living. So the human good, when we're describing humans, our life form is comprised of things that we ordinarily think of as necessary for a good life. So living in a sheltered accommodation, not living outside, being nourished, enjoying reading, being content, having personal relationships. So each individual human life is then judged in relation to this broader picture. So she acknowledges as well the variety of life, but she thinks that there is something that runs across the board in each species, and it's in relation to this that that we're judged. So imagine she's looking at a big population of 100 people, and she's looking at what runs across the board. Humans have 2 legs. Humans enjoy living in communities, and then each individual is. So we have one person who lives in isolation, and she would say that person is defective, to use Footian terminology, according to this species life form. This leads us on to premise 2 on the screen, according to which to situate the organism against the background of its species requires us to consider it from a normative perspective. A quote on page 34 of Natural Goodness here. For example, because deer escape from predators by running, a certain degree of swiftness is required for a deer to be good qua deer. Against these standards, we can make a normative assessment of the individuals in question. So there is an instance of natural defect when individuals don't live up to the Aristotelian categoricals of their kind, as I was just saying. So in doing this, it's important to note that she recognises organisms as functionally organised. So these vital operations function within a broader picture of the life of the species. So it's this characteristics functioning within this broader picture. Given this, Aristotelian categoricals have an interesting form, which I've written down here. They are logical concepts rather than empirical ones. So to situate the organism against the background of its species just is to assess that organism against what is normal for organisms of that species. So That is, to view anything as a living being is ipso facto to view it according to natural norms. Take the example here, tigers have 4 legs. This is not a contingent fact on the development of a present set of tigers. So a disease, for example, might remove every left leg of every tiger on the earth, and that wouldn't prove false, the claim that tigers have 4 legs. And it's also not a hypothesis about past tigers. The generality expressed by tigers have 4 legs isn't universal or statistical. So from the fact that tigers have 4 legs, it doesn't follow that a particular tiger has 4 legs, or even that any tiger living now has 4 legs. Additionally, it is not determined by counting all the tigers and taking an average of their number of legs. So because the tiger has 4 legs is a true Aristotelian categorical, we can also say that tigers need 4 legs. So these Aristotelian categoricals correspond to what Foot, following Elizabeth Anscombe, refers to as Aristotelian necessities. So Anscombe has this claim that what is needed or necessary is that on which the good hangs. Foot's very influenced and very impressed by Elizabeth Anscombe. In this sense, an oak tree needs deep roots to be a good, excellent oak tree. A particular oak tree must have deep roots, and this is so because deep roots play an important part in the life of the oak. So now, transition to human beings. We've set up our understanding of the 2 premises of non-human animals and plants, and I've used examples of oak trees and of tigers. So halfway through the book, a chapter called Transition to Human Beings helps us understand how this works in the human life form. So this is a really unique and interesting move, I think, in her application of this argument to human beings. So she's set this up, and now she's saying, how does this relate to humans? She claims that evaluations of goodness for human beings are of the same form as evaluations for goodness of other beings, such as wolves, peacocks, and oak trees. So quoting here from page 44, the concept of a good human life plays the same part in determining goodness of human characteristics and operations that the concept of flourishing plays in the determination of goodness in plants and non-human animals. The characteristics that reflect goodness in human beings are obviously very different to those that reflect goodness in peacocks or oak trees, but the form of evaluation remains the same for Foot. So another quote here from page 39, there is no change in the meaning of good between the word as it appears in good roots and as it appears in good dispositions of the human will. Notably for Foot, the lives of non-human animals are exhausted by what she calls life cycles. That is, development, self-sustenance, and reproduction. All the individual operations that occur in animals and plants function according to and are judged by these life cycles. So everything that my dog does, everything that the plant growing in my living room does, operates according to either development, self-sustenance, or reproduction. So in Foot's analogy between humans and non-human animals, if this holds in a straightforward sense, this would lead her to a morally offensive claim, such as something like human beings who are deemed disabled or sterile or lacking in some sort of mental capacity might be seen on this view as defective members of the species in a normative sense of the term. But to do this would be a superficial reading of Foot's position, because in understanding a transition to human beings, we also have to understand that it's crucial to the human good that we are able to recognize and respond to reasons for action. It is precisely the application of reasoning in our action that interests us in ethical evaluation. So moral evaluations of human beings are specially connected to voluntary actions and thus do not correspond to any equivalent evaluations of goodness in plants or non-human animals. So she explains, as I've quoted here on page 66, to speak of a good person is to speak of an individual not with respect of his body or faculties such as sight and memory, but as concerns his rational will. The excellent exercise of practical rationality, I quote, is something on which the good hangs in human life, aka an Aristotelian necessity. As Foot says, natural goodness in reason following is as much a form of goodness in humans as is proper instinctive behaviour in animals. That's on page 11 to 12 in Rationality and Goodness, which is Foot's final paper following Natural Goodness. So just as nearsightedness counts as a defect in human beings because of the function of sight in human life, injustice counts as a moral defect in human beings because of the function of cooperation in human life. So propositions such as humans are cooperative and humans are compassionate count as genuine Aristotelian categoricals in Foot's view. Immorality, in this case, and in this sense, is a natural defect for human beings, and moral goodness is a form of natural goodness. It's an aspect of what makes us good as human beings. Foot claims that the content of practical rationality is determined by natural facts about human beings. So as I said at the beginning, so just summarizing here, Foot's neo-Aristotelian naturalism, as she pursues it, must be understood as a thesis concerning rationality, where practical rationality is seen as a species' relative capacity. So we only understand what practical rationality is according to our life form. Foot claims that vices are defects in our responsiveness to reasons for action, which constitutes a sort of natural defect in humans, and specifically individuals with who are vicious, who operate on the vices, will have defective wills for Foot under her theory. So because we're able to act rationally and we have a capacity to reason, we are subject to distinctive forms of evaluation, which plants and non-human animals aren't. So unlike other natural defects, such as not being able to see, blindness, or inability to have children, which may simply be the result of bad luck, we are responsible for our conception of how we act, and therefore we can answer to rational criticisms of that conception. So there's a lot more to be said on Philippa Foot's naturalism, and I urge you to read Natural Goodness. I'll stop sharing my screen. Yeah, and John Hacker-Wright's books are particularly enlightening on her naturalism. Yeah, thank you very much for listening.